hello everyone, wherever you've dialed in from. Whether you're here in the UK, like myself, or from Nicaragua, or the US, Mexico, wherever you're dialing in, a huge welcome. We're here today with Operations Nation, and today's topic is solving the challenges of remote work operations. We're going to do a quick intro to Operations Nation, who we are. We'll introduce you to our amazing panelists, and then we'll get into a great interactive panel discussion, inspired by the many questions that you already submitted via Eventbrite. And then we will wrap up. Get ready for a whistle-stop tour on remote working operations. So a little bit about ON. So it was co-founded by myself, Charlene. I'm the COO of Lantum, which is a health tech startup here in the UK. And also with Ashrina, serial head of operations, and Astrid, an operations consultant. And we absolutely love operations, are obsessed with it. And so although we have our day jobs on the side, we decided to start an organization that would bring a wealth of operations experience and knowledge and content to the great wide world of operations. Seeing as there's, it's more so now, but historically there's been a lot less resources that are specifically for ops leaders. So we're really excited to host events like this and bring content online on our digital platform. And we'll tell you more about how to get involved and stay connected. I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists today. So we've got Alex, who is a serial entrepreneur and has helped to build many startups, including Serona Ventures, Life Slice, and Crypto Fighters. We've got Dee, who's the co-founder and CEO of Boundless, who has been a 3-time COO. So I think all of us COOs are definitely in awe of Dee's experience, over a decade building B2B SaaS businesses. So knows very well operational challenges of setting up remote teams. And we've got Duncan Macintosh, who's the co-founder at Shield Geo, who has had a very international life, originally from Australia, but has lived across Europe and Asia, and so also has experienced firsthand the challenges of running remote teams. And he is currently dialing in from Barbados. Before we get started, and before we even get into the glossary, we'd just love to, for our panelists to just kind of start by sharing with us a little bit about your companies. And also, so for those of you guys who read the backgrounds and maybe confused, what are the differences between the different companies? It'd be great if when you introduce your business, just say kind of what your core competency is within this industry, and then we could get a picture of how you're similar or different to each other. That would be great. So maybe we can start with Dee.
Thanks so much for having me, Charlene, and the team. My name is Dee Coakley. As Charlene mentioned, I'm CEO and co-founder of a business called Boundless. I spent 10 years in COO roles and experienced the challenges of trying to run people operations for internationally distributed teams firsthand. Found it so incredibly painful that I decided to make it my life's mission to try and solve that problem. So now I deal with the thing that was my biggest nightmare and biggest headache. I do it all day, every day. So Boundless, we focus on, we have our own infrastructure in the countries that we support workers in, and we act as the employer of record, the legal employer for our customers' workers. So customers through us can within minutes get set up to employ someone in a new country, and we take care of all of the headaches and admin around employment compliance, dealing with the local HR regulations, tax filings, payroll payments, and so on.
Great, thanks so much, Dee. Alex?
Sure, thanks Charlene, and thanks everyone for having me. So I'm the co-founder of Deel. At Deel, what we do is we help companies hire people as independent contractors or employees in a very simple solution, one-click solution. So we help you if you want to hire someone as an independent make sure that the relationship is as kosher as possible through localized contract collection of documents. And if you think that person should be an employee, then we have a mix between our own infrastructures in the countries where we feel comfortable opening and as we're rolling it out, and different partners in the countries that are a bit more complex. We are VC-backed, raised a little under $50 million so far, supporting over 700 customers from SMBs all the way to public companies. And yeah, we're a team of 65 in 20 different countries today. So we're dogfooding and using our own product every day. So excited to see how we can maybe help some of you.
Great, thank you so much. And Duncan.
Thanks, Charlene, and thanks for having me. My name's Duncan Macintosh. I'm one of the co-founders of Shield GEO. We're also a global employer of record service provider, so the same as Dee. We've been operating since 2000. We've been operating for 6 years as Shield GEO, more or less, and prior to that, we were using our other company called Contractor Taxation, and prior to that, I've worked in contingent workforce management, which would encompass this EOR service and contractor management since about 2001. So I saw all the stuff that went on through the noughties, and then the morphing of what was sort of the contractor management business into this employer of record service. So we're now offering it in over 100 countries, and we've got a blend between our own entities and we use downstream partners. And we've got, I think, about 55 employees to date. We've added a few recently. And they're also spread across the world. So we actually employ all of our guys where we don't have an entity through our own service as well. So we both sell the service as well as live it ourselves. So we're a very remote team. I think we're across 16 different countries at the moment, just in our internal team, and that seems to be growing.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you for those brief intros. We'll hear a lot more. Before we get to our glossary, I just wanted to highlight, kind of why we're here. It should be obvious, but this event is so timely. We were really inspired to put it together because we all know that in a world of globalization and the onslaught of tech startups, remote working is not new, but to state the obvious, with the pandemic, a lot of us are finding our companies now completely remote working. So we're really looking at how do we adapt as organizational leaders. So this is perfect timing for this. So now I just want to highlight the quick glossary. So as typical with all industries, there are TLAs, 3-letter acronyms. So we just wanted to highlight a few. So Duncan, since we had a great conversation about sort of the differences, and these were new to me, I was wondering if you could just highlight and do a little glossary before we get into the conversation.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as you say, these are industry words completely made up by those of us who work in the industry and mean absolutely nothing to anybody else. So the PEO actually is born out of the United States. So a PEO is a professional employer organization. You can use it, you can actually use all three interchangeably, but if we're going to be specific, the PEO is mainly a US-centric term based about providing the service in the US. So rather than employer of record organization or a GEO, which are the same thing, where the service provider actually employs the client's employee in a country where they don't have an entity. So the EOR actually becomes a legal local employer and responsible for everything that entails. Whereas a PEO is something they used in the US when you don't want to register and set up in another state, because all the states are totally different. So what people do, as an example, is maybe they've got a New York company and they want to employ someone in California. Now, rather than registering for tax and social and everything else you have to do to set up in a new state, you co-employ them with a PEO. So the PEO will be registered in that state. They will employ them for you, but in a co-employment model where you remain liable for all of the compliance issues other than running the payroll. And even if there are errors with the payroll, that's still the client's responsibility, not the PEO. So that's essentially the difference. Whereas the EOR is employer of record, GEO is a global employment organization. They both are third-party employers who employ and payroll your staff for you in a country where you either don't want to employ them yourselves or you don't have the infrastructure set up to do it yourself. So as far as I'm aware, that's the distinction between the two, really.
Excellent. Thank you so
Dee,
much.
did I get that right?
Well, it's really interesting when you research this, you go down a rabbit hole and you find loads of conflicting information online and loads of conflicting definitions. And as Duncan said, these are just made up definitions. You won't find them in a dictionary. So it's difficult to say who's right. You know, who knows what these terms actually mean. People use them differently.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that primer. I love that 101. So let's dig into it because we've got a bunch of ops leaders. We want to figure out how do we do stuff. So I would love to start. I mean, as I mentioned, the obvious trends around COVID, people are starting to work remotely from the countries that we're not necessarily headquartered in. For those of us who are in the UK facing the post-Brexit world, we'd love to take this opportunity to just talk through a lot of the questions that came through around like different arrangements. What are some of the most common, I guess, arrangements that you're seeing as being a fit for purpose, like for people who are trying to keep an eye on employees who are different countries that aren't the headquarters? And we'd just love to hear if you could give an overview of what are the different options, not going so much into the geographic details, but just like what are the arrangements, what are the tax implications, and what are some of the things that we should be thinking about as ops leaders?
I'd say the first thing you need to consider, sorry if I jumped the gun, guys, is tax residency is really what it's all about. So it depends if they're existing employees or new hires, because if they're new hires, you could go down Alex's route with the contracting or with an EOR or to set it up yourself. But if you've got existing employees who are doing exactly what I'm doing, I'm in Barbados. The most important thing to keep your eye on is the tax residency of the individual. So if they're triggering tax residency in a country that they're not employed and paying tax on, it can obviously lead to issues with, you know, if I was to trigger tax residency here, I need to start paying tax in Barbados. I pay tax in the UK as a tax resident. So I think the most important thing is look at the tax residency rules for each of the countries these people are in and make sure you're not in breach of those. That's where to start. And then you can look at the HR implications. If you're working in remotely, I'll just use my example from Barbados, and I trigger that, and I have to start paying tax, do I then need to be payrolled and employed in Barbados under Bayesian law rather than UK law? They're the ones that I would certainly look at to start with. And then you can look into the corporation tax issues as well, which would be around permanent establishment. I don't know if we want to go down that rabbit hole, but you know, if there was to be an issue with that, I doubt it. You know, the person would have to be selling services in that particular country. But I've seen it happen during the first lockdown with some of the investment banks where guys were basing themselves in the south of Italy and making deals on behalf of a British bank that then opened up an absolute wrath of, you know, corporation tax implications. That's where I'd start anyway.
Great, thanks for sharing that. Maybe Dee, is there anything you'd want to add to that beyond the tax implications? Or yeah, what are other big things?
Yeah, so I think COVID movers, I mean, this is something we are seeing very, very commonly. A large proportion of our sales calls at the moment are with companies where they've had people put in requests to move back to home countries, or people who went back to home countries for the first lockdown, thinking this is going to be a few weeks and they just do a working holiday. And they are now essentially stuck in those countries or choosing to stay in those countries. As Duncan said, it's about the tax residency. Generally, for a lot of the countries that you will be looking at, it's about the 183-day rule. If an individual stays overnight for over 183 days in any rolling 12-month period, it is pretty likely they will have some tax obligations in that country. You should look at every country on a country by country basis and check out at what point it is that individual incurs tax obligations in that country. But the 1883 rule is quite a common one. You will find that individual will have tax obligations in a country once they have some kind of tax residency or they go over whatever the limit is. You as the employer will also have obligations, and you unfortunately you cannot feign ignorance. It's not considered a defense. You have an obligation as an employer to know where your people are I realize that can be difficult with remote teams. I did hear a story once from a tax consultant based in the UK who had worked with a client where an employee had moved to the Republic of Ireland. They'd married someone in the Republic of Ireland, made a permanent move, just never mentioned it. They were working remotely, never came up in conversation. They decided not to highlight the fact that this was happening. But of course, in the Republic of Ireland, they had kids at school, they probably had car insurance, and the Irish government eventually said, who are you? You've been here for 3 years, you seem to have an income, where is it coming from? And this particular consultant, it took over a year to resolve this. It all had to be unpicked, and of course the employer faced fines and had to pay those fines. So yeah, you do need to keep on top of this stuff. That's just tax. Duncan also referred there to employment regulations. People will have entitlements to the employment rights of any country that they are living in. Even if you have someone sign up to, say, for example, an employment agreement with your UK entity, and that employment agreement states that the jurisdiction of the contract is the courts of England and or whatever part of the UK it is that your company's in, that individual could always make a claim through an employment tribunal in the country that they are in at any given point in time. So you have an obligation to be on top of what the employment regulations are in that country. And this is the kind of thing that, you know, a company like any of the 3 companies here today can help with, because we have expertise in the local employment regulations. We stay on top of all of the changes, and we proactively keep our customers informed around all of that. And we make sure that the individual is signed up to the right type of agreement and being given the right employment terms.
Actually, just one thing I forgot while Dee was speaking, it reminded me, is the visa implications. So if you've got people like, you know, in a country and they're there for 6 months, most of us can get visas for 6 months on entry, or 3 to 6 months, and you can renew it. But if you've got somebody who doesn't do that, doesn't adhere to the regulations, then you've got someone illegally working in a country also not paying tax there. So it's the double whammy of you know, breaking the visa regulations and becoming a tax resident of a country you're not paying tax in. So yeah, that's another one.
Great. So I'd love to hear about kind of post-Brexit specific stuff. So a lot of our companies, you know, I've been employing EU nationals, et cetera. So I guess what are some of the biggest things to look out for post-Brexit? Are there any new issues or the kind of hot topics that we should really be addressing or looking at?
Well, you know, having lived in the UK and coming from France myself, so, you know, we're pretty familiar with that. We're using our UK company for lots of that. I'm not 100% sure what's going to happen with the concept of foreign employment, which is being able to hire from the UK outside of the UK in Europe. So I can't really comment on that. Also, it's not something we're really focused on. You know, I think that kind of ties back to what we just touched on the taxation part. I think one thing that's really important is talking to your teammates, talking to your team and understanding, hey, like, what are you planning on doing? So we had a couple of people move to another country for 3-4 months, but eventually come back to the UK. So understanding what's their long-term plan so that you can actually act on that is the most important part. And then, you know, based on that, whether you decide to open a company in another EU country and then, you know, do the employer of record, do the foreign employer model back again, whether you decide to use a service like ours, this is kind of up to you. You know, how you want to set up the relationship and what's the pricing model. Also seeing, you know, a lot of companies. So, you know, for us, we're kind of completely unbiased on the different relationships and how you want to set it, whether you want to set it as an independent or an employee. We've moved in a way that we're really unbiased towards that. We're here to support you regardless. So thinking through how you see that person through the company and in the lifetime of the company, right? If this is maybe like a C-level and exec level, and you really think you should set up the right thing there, and you might expand into that country, then, you know, considering opening a subsidiary there makes more sense. When it's a one-off hire, that's, you know, going to stay at the company for a long time and have management power, maybe that the EOR model would make more sense. So it's very situational. It's really hard to give like a general opinion on that. And when it comes to Brexit and Europe, yeah, this is something that I'm sure we're all getting quite a bit of sales calls on that topic, and this is something you're going to have to be on top of. So I'm hopeful that it, you know, there's some ties to the EU that might leave us in a situation where we might have easier ways to deal with it. But right now, it looks like some companies are going to have to start using our companies.
That's good for you guys.
Do you guys have any? Because I haven't really looked into foreign employer angle in a while really, but I'm not sure if there was any updates on that front regarding Brexit.
I personally don't think it's going to be. It's actually probably going to be beneficial to us as in our businesses, because I think that we can provide more advice and more value add to our clients. But Brexit, from an employment perspective, presumably we're not talking about the trade issues between the UK and the EU, and I'm not going to go into my opinion on the whole thing. As a non-EU national, I'm going to park it. But I think it's an immigration issue from our perspective. British people will find it harder to work in Europe. Europeans will find it harder to work in the UK, and there'll be that restriction. The other one is, up to this point, and I don't know how Brexit's affecting this, but it will. Any European country can can register as a foreign employer in any other European country and just have to run payroll in that country. You don't have to set up an entity. So I presume that option is just going to be off the table once I don't know how long the cooling off period is, but after that, I imagine that's off the table. And as I said before, I think it'll be an immigration issue for us involved in the employment world. But otherwise, I don't see it as certainly a big issue for anyone who isn't based in the UK or trying to work in the UK, or UK national trying to work in Europe.
I think the impact of Brexit from companies' perspectives, if you are an employer in the UK, the impact was really felt quite severely as soon as the vote was announced. And I know many companies have said companies hiring software developers particularly, or people with kind of quite specialist tech talent. A lot of companies said that they found the number of applications they were getting plummeted. So I know a number of companies, including one that I was previously COO of, have opened up dev teams in other countries and have started to really open up to international employment. But I think that's been something that's been going on over the last couple of years as a result of the Brexit vote. So it's not necessarily a short, sharp hit that is coming on the 1st of January. The impact has been felt for a while.
No, you're absolutely right, Dee. And yeah, I didn't mean to imply that this is, something new. You're right. I saw a bunch of particularly fintech companies. I was running a fintech prior to working at Lantum, and I mean, everyone was scrambling because of passporting, right? So the beauty of having an FCA license is being able to passport it across the EU, but then suddenly are you having to get a payment license in multiple countries? But we're not here to talk about regulation. So I'd love to transition to talk about, Alex, you were kind of hinting at this, and we had so many questions about the global expansion angle. So regardless of COVID, regardless of Brexit, as our startups are scaling up and we're expanding our footprint, I know I experienced this when I ran my fintech company. We founded the company in Kenya, but then we wanted to expand to Nigeria and Ghana and Senegal. But in a couple of the countries, we weren't ready to really invest full footprint. So we wanted to test the market, and so we looked at hiring contractors, and but then how do you make that decision to is it a certain head count, where then you look at setting up a subsidiary, setting up an office, or, so I'd love if you guys could just share, with other clients, or maybe your own experiences in your own startups. Like, what are some of the important things to ask yourself or to deal with as you're thinking about global expansion and the different options?
So contractors, I think most companies, or a lot of businesses, will always have contractors of some kind. We use contractors from time to time at Boundless, where anything is very project-based or very time-bound. And Alex referred to the fact, you look at the work that you need done and you consider the longevity of this potential engagement. And obviously, if someone's a longer term type engagement, then this is something you need to consider. If it's very short term, if this individual really is a contractor, if they're a consultant, for example, and they have multiple clients, that's really clear cut. That's a contractor. Every country has very, very different rules around worker classification. And there is a piece of research to be done in any country an individual is based in to find out what's a contractor and what is an employee in that country. Broad brush strokes, but you know, this is generalization here, but and some countries are really, really clear. Portugal has a list. You know, a lot of other countries, it's a slightly grayer area, but broad brush strokes, what will generally be considered a contractor is an individual that has multiple clients. They're working on a fixed term project for you. They're being paid for the work that they do. So perhaps they're being paid by the hour or by deliverables. So they're being paid different amounts at different points in time. Most governments will look at that and say, that's a contractor. If an individual works full time for you, if you're their only client and their only source of income, if they're getting paid the same amount each month, if they have a company email address and they attend internal company meetings, many governments will look at an individual like that and say, this is an employee and this individual has to be classified as an employee. And I think a few years ago, governments weren't so proactive about taking action around this stuff. I think this year with COVID, a lot of, you know, I haven't heard as much this year as last year, but no doubt governments will come back around to focusing on this stuff. But last year in 2019, a lot of governments started to fine people and take actions for misclassification of workers. And it's across two areas. First of all, tax compliance, but secondly, compliance with employment regulations. And again, you can't feign ignorance as the company. You need to be on top of this stuff.
Great, thank you so much for that, Dee. Yeah, Duncan, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, Dee was bang on, but the other thing is, I think that in this whole service provision, so from what Alex at Deel does with the contractors and in what Dee and I do for the employer of record, and then even when you go to entity establishment, I think contractors can play a part in that cradle to grave client experience. So if you're just going into a country initially for 3 months and the legislation allows you, then maybe you could employ someone as a contractor for 3 months and then transition them to an employment contract once, you know, you've got justifiable reason to employ them, as long as the legislation allows. I do think there's that experience, and then the client will go to a service maybe like ours, or then set up their own entity. But there is a place for it. It's just you've got to make sure you don't fall foul of those regulations. And we've spoken to so many clients that have been hammered by doing exactly that, employing contractors where they shouldn't. But it is hugely country specific, this misclassification of contract workers legislation. I think the US, Canada, UK, Australia, most European countries are pretty heavy on it. So I would do it, but I'd apply Dee's test to it if I was going to do it as a client. I go down the employment route if you can. Sorry, Alex, you go.
Yeah, go for it. As you know, the way I look at it is every company have different relationship with their teammates. Every single teammate and every single company will look at the relationships in different ways. So it's really hard to say. I think it's actually a wrong thing to say, like, if you don't do X, you're going to get in trouble. Or if you don't do Y, you're going to get in trouble. Every single way you interact with a specific teammate plays a different part into how you set up the relationship. And there's lots of different factors to it, right? Employer of record is actually illegal in Belgium. So how are you going to work with someone in Belgium, right? What's going to be your solution there? So the idea of like both models, I mean, if you look at the EOR model, and this is, again, something we support ourselves directly, this is something we work with Duncan on some things as well. So this is a model I like a lot. And when I look at both, I'm thinking, what's the relationship and how do you want to set it up? And the truth of the matter is sometimes an independent relationship will make more sense. Sometimes an EOR relationship will make more sense. Sometimes you won't have the funds to be able to afford an EOR relationship. So what are you going to do? Not employ that person. So you're working through the relationship. And by the way, if you look at different jurisdictions, there is ways for you to be better in that relationship around who owns the equipment, how long is that person working, what's the scope of the contract, right? So there's ways for you to work through that. And at the end of the day, what I don't like about generally the employment market is to tell customers, if you don't do that, you're going to get in trouble, you're going to get sued, which is not always true. You have to look at the relationships individually and think, hey, for that specific person, how do I feel about setting up that relationship? And whether it's, and the important thing is whatever you decide to do, one, you need to make sure from a practicality standpoint, not just the theoretical standpoint, that it's done well, right? If you want to go the contractor route for someone, make sure that they're set up the right way from a taxation perspective, from an equipment perspective, everything there needs to be done well. If you want to go down the EOR path, then you believe that person should be an employee. So You need to look at the facts and think, hey, for that specific, because at the end of the day, what you'll see is a lot of companies, they come and talk to us and they say, oh, we have those 3 people we want to put on EOR. And if you dive a little bit more, they have those 20 people they have as contractors. They just don't talk about it because, one, they can't afford it for those people. Second, they don't believe that relationship should be classified that way. But the way you look at the relationship is always very important. And I think what we're doing on the EOR side is very helpful for a lot of those companies, and it's gonna, like you said, make them feel like, in some cases, actually, I would argue that some of our customers feel like the EOR model, which means third-party employer, because at the end, you're really an employer. You're not a shell company, right? Because that would go against all of those principles. Feel like they're losing some hold on their employees as well, because they don't have the direct relationship as well, and they shouldn't have that direct relationship from a legal perspective. So it's very situational. So I always look at those things, and I really hate the black or white in that market. It's going to be at every company level, however you want to look at that relationship and whatever you feel is the right way to handle that specific relationship. Sorry, I'm pretty passionate about that subject because we always get that question.
No, don't apologize. I love the passion, and thank you guys. It's clear you guys all really know the industry, and definitely will get to a point. I like what Alex said, which is it's really tempting. I'm sure there's a lot of people in the audience who like have these very specific questions of like, this is my situation. And so our attempt is to kind of paint fairly broad strokes, but I'm sure people have very specific questions about specific things. So, but it is good to keep in mind that there's sort of an ethos of the relationship that you want to have with the people who are working with you, whatever, regardless of legal status. So given time, we're going to zip along to the next topic, which is really around geography. And again, with the caveat that we do not have time to go through all 150 plus countries. If you could, as broad strokes, like, are there more difficult countries to do these kind of third-party employer relationships? Are there some that are preferable? Obviously, you're not, ambassadors of all the countries, but just, I'm going to do an open-ended, because I'm sure you hear this all the time. So anyone who wants to kick it off.
This stuff is endlessly fascinating. It is incredible when you look at how challenging some countries are to operate in. Particularly if you're coming from somewhere like the UK, where the UK is not hugely challenging. Dealing with the government in the UK, things tend to be quite black and white. I was based out of the UK for 12 years and ran businesses there. There's not so much grey area. There are so many countries where there's a whole lot of grey. And there are also a lot of countries where employment regulations mean that being an employer is a challenging task, and particularly terminating people. So any country you look at, if you're considering employing people directly or through an employer of record, the first thing I would look at is how easy is it to terminate someone in that country? And there are some countries like the Netherlands and Germany where you have to go in front of a judge and plead your case. You need to explain why it is that you're terminating this person. And there's a chance the judge will just say, no. It's quite different to somewhere like the UK. Usually there'll be some kind of compensation component involved. In the Netherlands, newer legislation in the last couple of years has meant you have much greater visibility over what that compensation might be before you get to that point. It used to be, a much more box of chocolates kind of thing. You didn't know what you were going to get until you got in and talked to that judge. So yeah, be really aware of termination is the thing I'd say is the key thing to check out initially. There is a whole host of other things that you'll need to be aware of. Even if you're not sure you want to work with an employer of record, all of the 3 companies here, any other companies in this space, generally will have really strong materials. I know us at Boundless, we're always happy to talk with people. We'll talk through their situation and help them in any way that we can and give them advice, even if they're not sure they'll become a customer right now. We've often had people talk to us on that basis. thinking we might never work with them, and then they come around again a few months later. So we're quite happy to give that kind of advice. So an employer of record is quite a good place to start if you have questions about a specific country, and the individual you're dealing with can talk you through the realities for that country. Or often these companies will have country guides or other materials they can share with you so that you can get to grips with the employment rules for that country.
What I can't believe you didn't say, D, is France, and just finish the conversation. That's fine, particularly with Alex on the call. Yeah, I mean, Dee's absolutely right. The termination piece is the most important aspect, and we've actually got a team dedicated to that, to the termination process in each of our engagements, called an offboarding team, who specifically manage that role because it's so important. But if you were just to talk, the other issue is with the regulations. Like, third-party employment often isn't even regulated in some countries, well, in a lot of countries. In fact, in most countries, because it's not even a notion that the government have even tackled. Places like some of the Southern European countries don't necessarily have legislation that specific talks to third-party employment because they haven't sort of recognised it as a normal means of employment. But as a rule, I think Europe is one of the most challenging places to employ people because of termination, cost of termination, and the very employee-centric legislation. And then any of those countries that the Latin European countries colonized, they've just followed the same legislative process. So Latin America is really challenging as well. Mexico's just passed a new piece of legislation that is just madness. And it means that all of us doing this stuff in Mexico are going to have to revisit what we're doing. So that's just regulations. And then in terms of employment law, yeah, Latin America is hard. North America is relatively easy. I'm including Mexico and Latin America for the purposes of that conversation. Australia is very easy, being, it's like much like the UK and Canada. And then Asia is relatively straightforward, where it's apart from the regulatory stuff. But in terms of the employment law, it's relatively straightforward compared to, say, Europe or Latin America. And then Africa is a massively mixed bag because, you've got countries that were colonized by the Portuguese, for instance, and they have very Portuguese-focused law, whereas South Africa is fairly easy because it's an ex-UK colony. So you've got all these different things. But when I see a sale come through and it's from Asia, you breathe a sigh of relief. You're not really going to have any issues. Whereas as soon as someone says France, you just have a little cry, basically. But it is tough. But you have to know it, as Dee said. We have the expertise. But telling an American client how hard it is to employ somebody in France, it often goes straight over their head. They think employment at will, and they go to fire somebody, and you say, this is what's going to happen. No, you never told me that. Like, well, I think I've probably had 20 conversations about it. You just chose to ignore it because you love the romantic notion of having a sales guy in Paris. I think Alex probably can talk to this better than any of us, being French.
Yeah, I mean, setting up in France was probably one of the most painful things that I've ever done. To some extent, the way we approach that is that as much as, we similarly to Dee and Duncan, we try to own the infrastructure wherever we feel comfortable with the law. There's some countries where the truth is I don't think we'd ever want to do it, right? Like, there's some countries where it's so complex that I would never really feel comfortable telling one of my customers, I really understand deeply employment law. I have a Chinese co-founder. In Beijing, you need a proper, you need actually to have a license by the government to employ in Beijing. So I would never feel comfortable doing it in Beijing. So the way we look at it is, when you look at employment in all those countries, and I think most of the people here would probably agree with me, is in the countries where we feel really comfortable, we will do it, and we'll do it for you the right way. The ones that are a bit more complex, we would go ahead and just partner with local people that actually really know the roles and know how to make it work. And I think that's really important because most of the companies come to us and they expect us to really understand deeply labor laws everywhere. And if we were to own the infrastructure, we would have to do it everywhere. So being very selective as per where, as a company, we look at you and we say we know what we're doing, versus being able to tell you that I really know how to employ someone in Shanghai versus Beijing, that wouldn't really be true. So working with the right people in different legislation and regions and geos is super important. And that's how I kind of look at it. So every single country is vastly different on the termination, on the way the employment is set up. And to touch on that point, I think Duncan is right. Every single time I talk to a US customer, they look at us and they're like, oh, but $600, $1,000, that's so expensive. It's like, do you understand that this is not a PEO? We're not sharing liability. Like, if that goes bust, we go bust with it to some extent. And there's definitely some education. And being a company that that went global first because of the nature of it, and had serving customers from a little everywhere today. It's really fun to see how, it's fair to not know how France termination work if you're from the US, I guess, but it's just really funny how different employment is and how you think about employment really can be.
Great. Thank you so much for that around the globe tour. Yes.
Can I just mention something just before we move on? If people are considering, I think right now, a lot of people are finding themselves in situations where it's not necessarily a considered approach to which countries they have people in because of COVID moves and so on. People are having to be reactionary. But if you are in a position where you're considering your strategy around international employment, when you look at different countries, you might also want to consider your ability to harmonize the employee experience for your employees in different places. I know a lot of people, heads of people ops at a lot of the high profile remote first companies. And this is something they spend a lot of time working on and trying to resolve, is harmonization of benefits and harmonization of employee experience. It is, if you have a very distributed team, you will never achieve perfect harmonization. It's simply not possible, no matter what kind of budget you have or what advisors you have. But trying to get as close as possible. So it's worth considering that. Again, that's something, you know, that an employer of record can help you with and talk you through if you're trying to make decisions. They can help you to understand. We have some infographics that we can share afterwards that cover benefits in different countries and help you to understand how different that can look.
Try selling health insurance for US EOR to a French guy. It's very interesting.
Great. Thank you so much for adding that, Dee. Actually, that's perfect segue into our last structured topic before we try to squeeze in a few questions from the audience. So that's the perfect segue. So we've talked a lot about the things to look out for. You guys have given some really helpful general advice. Love to hear if you could just share some advice on like, how do you get started, right? So assuming you figured out, okay, I may need to look at an employer of record. I'm looking at multiple countries. I'm looking at multiple situations. What's some of the advice you have to just like get started and think about this from, you know, a third party working with an organization like you guys? Questions came up around admin systems. You know, do you just outsource this or do you try to track things, you know, on Excel? Like, you know, are there different phased approaches? Like if you could say like, for this size company, you're not super well funded, but you're just starting to expand versus a mid-size, you know, post Series A, and then kind of moving up. If you guys could just kind of paint a picture of the journey of dealing with this situation.
I mean, what I'd say just to begin with is make sure you know what your options are. Like we don't, when we present it to a client, we don't say this is the only way. And as Alex said, contracting is illegal and you can't do this and you can't do that. Present them, take a look and find out what your options are. Like, is it feasible to employ them? As I mentioned before, if you're in Europe and you're in Spain and you want to employ someone in Italy, it's not that hard. You don't have to register. There's one option. You could register. What are the legalities around contracting? How long can you contract someone for before they become an employee? And so work that they're doing, will that trigger anything else? And then the other option is our option. So that's one of 3 or 4 options, and you make a decision based upon what's best for your needs. Using a PEO is not necessarily, an employer of record company is not necessarily the best option for everybody. If you've only got you don't have, you know, as Alex said before, a lot of funding. You know, you've got to not just pay the fees that we charge you, but you've also got to look at the employer social security contributions, which I'm going back to France, it's like up to 50%, and across all of Europe, it's very high, in Latin America as well. So, you know, take that into account, and then obviously seek advice on that. Now, I wouldn't suggest going and wasting your money talking to the Big Four if you don't have a Big Four budget to find out what the best option is, and they're not actually that well versed in what we do. So yeah, that for me, it's an education piece initially. And if you speak to any of the companies in this space, they'll be able to provide you with those options, and they'll tell you what the legislation is and tell you what they believe the best option, or provide you with those options. But we're all here to provide advice. We don't charge for it. We're not KPMG. So you can get that information from us, but and I know it's not that easy to find if you were to go on the net. I mean, hence the reason we were able to establish ourselves quite quickly is that this information isn't available, and most people don't know what they can and can't do. The amount of times we have US clients who come to us because they've tried to employ someone in Japan on a US employment contract, and the Japanese employee said, "I'm sorry, that's not worth the paper it's printed on," and they wanted to payroll them out of the US. So yeah, it's education for me to begin with anyway. And then funding, obviously, but that comes into it in your decision-making process.
I think Duncan has referred to this there, and he's absolutely right when he says it's about the stage that your business is at. And I think quite often a company will start to looking at using a PEO when the business is at a certain inflection point. And quite often that will be you've closed a large round of funding. So you start to get more formal in your processes. The board are, perhaps concerned about doing things the right way and making sure that the company is compliant. Often linked to that, a company will be bringing in someone who is, say, in a COO role or a head of legal. And generally people, I know the businesses that I was with when I was a COO, I understood employment regulations. I was not a country expert in many countries, but I understood employment law. I understood taxation. I understood our fiduciary duty as a business. So when I would come into a business, I would be looking and saying, well, this is not compliant. That's not compliant. We need to sort this out. So often it will be around an individual in a company who comes in and they spot some compliance challenges, and then they'll choose to make that move forward to a PEO. A lot of very early stage businesses, they're not so focused on compliance. You have a whole lot of problems to be dealing with. So I think it's one of those things you'll know when it's the time. Often at a funding round, investors will ask in due diligence, they'll ask to have some of this stuff sorted, or certainly if a company is prepping for a large funding round or prepping for an exit, you will want to be demonstrating that your team and the people building your assets, if your assets are technology or any kind of knowledge work, you'll want to demonstrate that it's your team, not external suppliers. So that can also be a consideration.
Yeah, I mean, just to add some color to that, I think there's definitely some people that it's our life's work. Duncan has been doing that for a long time. Duncan has experience on the contractor side. I'm a little unfamiliar with this experience with you as a CEO. I'm sure you had to deal with all of that. So I would say, compared to most of the market that was established before some of the companies like ours kind of came through, we're a lot less opaque. We're here to help. We're here to figure out, it would not be legal advice, but it would be helping you figure out what we believe might be the right thing to do in a specific situation. And I think we're all at a stage where we're all very excited to help all of you. So you should definitely ping all of us and figure out what's the best for you. And, when you think about building your team, I think like Dee says, it's going to be really hard to standardize across the whole spectrum of people. Not only because, not all our companies offers all the services around the world, but because, there's just very specific legislation and very specific thing you want to do for, some parts of your team versus the others. So, we're here to help. Don't be shy. Just hit us up, and whatever you need, we're here.
Just one more thing on that. We've been talking about the legislation and the options available to you as it relates to that. The other subject that we have a lot with our clients, and I think it's something that's happened in the last decade, is company culture and values. A lot of companies want to make people feel more like they're part of the team, even though they're a remote worker. When they're employed in a different country from where the organization is based, they want to make them feel part of the team. So a lot of the time, our clients not just concerned about compliance, but they want that employee engagement that at a PEO or setting up your own entity would enable. You can get them the right benefits, their payroll properly. They feel like they're part of the team. I think that's becoming a bigger and bigger reason for engaging this as well.
Thank you for sharing that. No, I loved what Dee started saying about the equity, right? So it's one thing to deal with equitable benefits, just within one country, but definitely as you expand, I found it particularly difficult as my company was expanding across sub-Saharan Africa, because we find some countries were big on things like 13th month, which isn't common in other countries. So it's like a 13, an extra month of salary.
Some countries do 14.
There you go. So yeah, just thinking about your culture and, obviously monetary compensation is just one piece of, salary and benefits. So like comp is a whole nother thing, but I just found that it's so interesting as you're trying to equalize, and also cost of living was another thing we dealt with, right? European salaries versus emerging market salaries, and how do you cope? And so it's great. It sounds like you guys are all like very full suite, almost like, not just the technical, but it's really the holistic approach, which I love. So cognizant, oh my goodness, time has flown by. So I'm going to try to grab some applicable questions that, so forgive me if I don't get to your questions. I'm going to try to cherry pick the ones that might be more applicable to multiple people, so we don't get into like a one-on-one advisory, but I'm sure that Duncan, Dee, and Alex are going to be more than available for more specific questions. But I love this one. We didn't talk about the differences in industry, so that's another way to pivot this conversation. So we have a question from Elizabeth of, can GEOs and employment EORs be used in highly regulated businesses? So like, are there things that are different for, say, financial services or like investment funds, which are highly regulated versus other employers, which are just, trading widgets, for example?
It comes down to a few things. Some of it's insurance. We won't be able to get insurance to employ certain people necessarily due to what we do, because it's sort of an overarching insurance policy that doesn't cover, say, telecommunication guys that are climbing up poles, which is something I was involved with about 5 years ago, which that kiboshed that deal because we just couldn't get the insurance. And the other thing is about, as you mentioned, the regulatory restrictions. We can't employ someone who has to be, to trade in the UK. On the market, you need to be registered with the local authorities. We can't have that legislation because we're an employer of record company, and that'll be the same across a variety of different industries. It'll be depending on whether you are able to legally employ someone without the specific registration. I mean, that's what we've found in our experience. I don't know about you guys.
Depends on the country. In some countries, transparently today where we own the infrastructure, this is not really something we're focused on. In the where we partner with people that have been here for a while, they've gone through that, so they've got some of those licenses in highly regulated industries. So come talk to us, tell us which industries, and we'll see if we can help.
Yeah.
Okay, great. This one's interesting. I guess this goes back a little bit to the geography question. So what do you think the most important state policies are for encouraging and facilitating environments for remote working? And so, for example, does Barbados offer anything beyond a preferable visa for workers? So maybe we can go back to, are you guys seeing any countries that are kind of like going above and beyond to attract remote working, which would be positive for both the employee and maybe also the employer?
So there are a number of countries that have launched visa programs that are targeted at digital nomads. So these are visa programs that make it very easy for that individual to come and spend time there. A slightly different benefit is around work from home. And a huge number of countries have either introduced new legislation or updated existing legislation around work from home this year. Of course, any company that's suffering from COVID restrictions, that means they have to have people working from home. That's beneficial, but it's also a really good driving force for remote work generally. So the UK, for example, where it used to be a bit of a challenge providing equipment to individuals, because that would then sit on your balance sheet as an asset, and then you'd have to try and reclaim that equipment back from individuals when they were leaving. There's new legislation that means that equipment can be given to individuals. They own that equipment outright from the day that they receive it, and they can retain ownership of that equipment. That's really, really helpful. Ireland, there is an e-worker tax-free allowance, so you can pay a stipend of up to a certain amount each month to your workers, and that's tax-free. And that's the idea, is that's to cover things like electricity costs, internet costs at home. A lot of other European countries have introduced tax breaks for individuals working from home this year as well. So yeah, it's worth looking into that if you have people in other countries. If you have an accountant in that country, ask them, they'll be up to date with the latest legislation, or you know, ask an employer of record company or someone like that.
This is probably where the only place where my country, France, didn't do too bad. They've actually made it a lot easier to get visas. So if you want to come work in Paris, that'll be easier.
Love it. Okay, I have just one last question. I'm so sorry to those of you who we couldn't get to, but just to kind of wrap it up, I love it open-ended, you know, crystal ball. What is your forecast for the industry in the next 5 years? No one could have predicted just the rapid pace of globalization, certainly not the pandemic, and well, not to get political, but you know, this increasing nationalization. But would love to hear, where do you see the industry in 5 years?
I think I thought 5-6 years ago when we officially got into this space that the market would become more competitive, which it has to some extent, but also we'd be squabbling over customers. And I was so categorically wrong from the very outset, as usual. And it's actually, all that's happened is there's more players in the market, in the EOR and in the contracting space. But what they're doing is they're educating more people on the service. So the market is actually expanding exponentially, not only due to COVID and the globalization and the move to remote work, which has been happening for 20 years, but it has now exploded. I think there's going to be more and more people working remotely, more and more people needing to use EOR services. You know, as there's more marketing collateral that we all publish, more and more people come to the table already realizing what their options are. When I used to do the sales, when with the two or three of us, and I would talk to clients and they wouldn't even know what an EOR was. I mean, and I know most people still don't, but nobody knew what nobody knew what it was. So it was more as an education piece. Now they come in knowing that this is an option, and they're probably speaking to a few other companies at the same time. So it's not such an education piece. It's more of a, what can you offer us that the other guys aren't? But yeah, I think it's going to just keep growing exponentially, certainly in the next 5 years. And I was wrong about the last 5, so hopefully I'm right about the next 5. But I do think it's going to become, and it's very popular. I'm sure these guys will all tell you, we're getting more inquiries now than we've ever had in the entire, I mean, I know that's going to happen as you get bigger, but much more inquiries than we've ever had before. It's quite remarkable. I mean, it's not surprising, but it is an industry that's bucked at the trend of the whole COVID situation and Brexit situation, if we want to throw that one in there too. That's my experience, or our experience anyway.
Yeah, what I'm interested in is to see how it's all gonna evolve, right? Like Dee said, doubling down on, hey, is that person independent, is that person employee? So I'm curious of how that's gonna evolve across the next few years. I think, like Duncan said, a lot of the EOR models are still not really regulated. There's not a lot of rules around it in Europe yet. Some countries, they don't know how to deal with it. So I think all of that is gonna get tidied up in the next few years. So seeing where it kind of goes, and I think, all the companies here will be very flexible in terms of like where this is all going to go, and probably be the first one to be there when anything changes. But how, at the end of the day, if you look at how work is done, and a lot of the people that you work with are definitely not what used to be an employee. Maybe when my father or my grandfather were working, it's not 9 to 5 anymore. There's a lot more flexibility where you're working from, how you're working. So how government will shift towards the future of work and the way people are actually starting to engage with companies is going to be quite interesting to me, and seeing how legislations are actually going to bend one way or another, or maybe both ways, covering both cases, and how to do it right for both is what makes me excited about the space and where it's going to go.
From my side, I think what we currently call remote work will start to become known as just work. We're seeing, given all of the changes that we've seen this year, we're seeing sectors that would never previously have considered having people internationally remote. They're finding themselves in that position, which means companies are far more open to this, and companies will start to hire and recruit locationless. And that's going to be completely transformative for the workforce. I think the other key thing that we'll see linked to that, of course, is democratization of access to really well-paid jobs, which is great for society and great for communities the world over, and particularly the likes of rural communities where good quality work might have been a challenge in the past. But we'll also start to see a lot of innovation around payroll that won't be specific to this type of space, but I think this space could be leaders in that. So, you know, PayPal in the US have just announced that they're trialing on-demand pay for their workers in the US. They're one of the early movers that are not a gig economy type workforce that are trialing that. So I think payroll is going, there hasn't been much innovation in payroll since the 1970s when companies shifted from check to electronic payments. We're going to see a lot of change over the next 5 to 10 years. It's going to become a pretty exciting space.
Wonderful. Well, I know we're a bit over time. I feel like we could hear from you guys for hours, but just want to give a huge thank you to you, Alex, Dee, and Duncan, for being so generous with your time, but also your knowledge. And just, it's clear that you guys care a lot about your clients and working with them and solving the problems that we're facing as we're trying to figure out how to do work across multiple time zones, countries, etc. So I'll wrap up here. A huge thank you for your time. If you enjoyed this event and you want to attend more events or even want to participate in being a speaker, we would absolutely love to hear from you. We are a large global community, and it takes a village to share operations information. So I won't read it out, but we've got a mailing list. So check out our website. We're on YouTube, so you can check out any other events you missed, like our Finance for Ops series. We're on LinkedIn. That's the most common place where we post information. We've got an email address, and also for future events, check out our Eventbrite. But on that note, just want to give another huge thank you to our amazing speakers and to all of you for your active participation. And look out, we will send a follow-up email with lots of juicy content so you can get in touch with our speakers, their respective companies, and also have just more information as you make hard decisions. So have a great night and hope to see you at the next On event.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so
everyone.
much.
Thanks, Charlene.
Thanks.
Bye.
Good night.